My guest at this time is Chris Jacobs. He is the founder and CEO of the Juniper Research Group, and he's also the author of the new book, The Case Against Singlepayer. We want to get his thoughts today as Democratic presidential candidate and Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren unveils what is essentially a single-payer health plan, and now she's given a few more details about how she plans to pay for it, although many analysts on all sides of the political spectrum believe that her plan is not exactly realistic. So why is that, and just how much would it cost? That's what we're going to get into here for the next few minutes. And Chris, thanks very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Elizabeth Warren says she can do this for slightly less than $52 trillion over 10 years, just single payer. A lot of folks believe it could take $34 trillion in new federal spending. She says she can do it in 20.5. She also claims that only billionaires will see tax increases. So where is she on the truth meter here about whether that can actually pay for things?
Very high on the Pinocchio reading, I would say. The idea is essentially that you can have free health care for everyone paid for by virtually no one, or 1% of the population. And first of all, her math doesn't work. There are a lot of gimmicks, unrealistic assumptions, and frankly, liberties she takes with her estimates. Secondly, from a societal point of view, it's entirely out of whack to say that everybody can get free health care paid for just by the 1%. The person who held her Senate seat, John Kennedy, said in 1960, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." This is essentially turning that principle on its head into a version of Oprah's Favorite Things, where everyone gets a free car paid for by somebody else.
So let's talk about the numbers here. She claims she can rack up $2.3 trillion in new revenue just by cracking down on tax avoidance. What's the realism check on that?
Well, the Congressional Budget Office said that cracking down on tax avoidance by increasing the IRS's enforcement budget would raise $35 billion with a B dollars. That's 1.5% of what Elizabeth Warren says she would generate. So it's slightly unrealistic to suddenly believe that you would get the other $2.3 trillion in that. It's also unrealistic in the sense that Elizabeth Warren presumes a lot of savings from reducing administrative costs for the new government-run program, and says that will save money. At the same time, she says that she can crack down on tax fraud and tax evasion to get $2.3 trillion. Well, if spending more on fighting tax fraud and tax evasion will generate additional revenue, then the converse of that proposition is that spending less on administrative costs will lead to greater health care fraud in the new system. So Warren is trying to have her cake and eat it too.
Talk about where she is on capital gains taxes. I know that's not really health policy, but she claims that capital gains tax increases indexed to what the very wealthy, the billionaires, would be paying in the actual income tax system is how she would actually crank up this revenue as well. So would this really be limited to the billionaires or pretty much anyone who has any capital gains?
Well, it would be very distortionary for one thing. The idea is one principle in the Warren plan is so-called mark-to-market. Essentially, that means if you're holding a stock and it goes from $30 to $40 within a year, you have to pay taxes on $10 worth of capital gains, regardless of whether or not you continue to hold the stock or not. Right now, you only pay taxes on capital gains when you sell the stock.
Right.
Elizabeth Warren would say for billionaires, you have to pay it every year, regardless of whether or not you cash in the stock. That would lead people to cashing in the stock just to pay for the taxes, and so you would have all sorts of unintended consequences. Second of all, if the stock market goes down, then people could write off those losses immediately. Think about 2009 when people's pensions, their 401ks, went down 30, 50% in the stock market. That means wealthy individuals could write off all that revenue at one time in 1 year by writing off those capital gains. That would lead to massive revenue fluctuations and potential losses for the federal government right in the middle of a recession. That's not good policy either.
We're talking with Chris Jacobs. The book is The Case Against Singlepayer. He's also the founder and CEO of the Juniper Research Group. And Chris, so if Elizabeth Warren's numbers don't add up, what kind of tax hike would we be realistically looking at if she actually were to get what she wants here? I've seen some estimates from bipartisan budget crunchers suggesting we'd have like a 42% VAT tax or sales tax, huge increases in payroll taxes, or an additional 25% lumped onto our income tax bills. So if this were to happen, what would we really be looking at?
You're exactly right. And the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, which is a nonpartisan organization, they're not liberal, but they're not conservative either. They're very much centrist budget hawks. Put out a report analyzing some of the ways to pay for single payer. They said one way was a massive new value-added tax, a sales tax that would add 30 to 40% to the price of most goods. Another way would be a massive increase in the payroll tax, a 30% increase in the payroll tax. One way that they broke it out for the average American would be to charge every American a $7,500 quote-unquote premium. Now, this wouldn't be a premium in the sense that it would be mandatory. It would effectively be a tax on every American. It would be $7,500 for every American, or $12,000 if you exempt people who are already on Medicare, Medicaid, et cetera. That's a hefty chunk out of most Americans' wallets.
Chris, you bring up a very interesting argument here about why Elizabeth Warren is doing the numbers game the way she is. You wrote about this in the Wall Street Journal. Basically, you're coming to the conclusion that she wants to do single payer. She just doesn't think the vast majority of Americans are willing to spend an extra dime to do it. So where does that leave her?
Right. That's the rhetorical question that's very difficult for her to answer. If this new healthcare system will be so good, because remember, you're canceling everybody's existing insurance. Employer-sponsored coverage goes away. TRICARE goes away. Even if you're on Medicare or Medicaid now, your coverage will go away and you'll get new coverage. If this plan is so good and so much better than what we have now, why won't you even ask the average American to pay so much as $10 towards this new plan? And that's a hard question for somebody like Elizabeth Warren to answer.
Her argument, of course, is that in the end, it'll cost less. So even if she ends up raising taxes on the middle class to some extent, the amount that they no longer have to pay in premiums, co-pays, deductibles, et cetera, it's all going to offset, and ultimately you're going to have more money in your pocket. What do you think about that?
Well, Bernie Sanders, unlike Warren, has actually admitted that single payer will require tax increases on the middle class. He's made the argument that people will come out on net better off after paying for the tax increases. The problem is that's not true with the studies we've seen. Kenneth Thorpe, who's an Emory University economist and actually worked on Vermont's single-payer plan, said that Bernie Sanders' math doesn't add up. He said that 71% of households would pay more under Bernie Sanders' plan back when he analyzed it back in 2016 than they do now under the current system. And there's one simple reason for that. People will pay more because they will consume more care. The idea that healthcare is now free, out of pocket, in terms of no co-payments, no deductibles, et cetera, will encourage people to consume more care. And so that will actually drive up total healthcare spending, and you will have to raise taxes to pay for all that additional spending.
Last question, Chris. We've seen such noted conservatives as Nancy Pelosi and Rahm Emanuel and some others, obviously on the left, who really don't want the Democratic presidential standard bearer to be pushing Medicare for all. I don't know if it's because of all the bruises they took over the Obamacare fight roughly a decade ago, or whether they just think it's a political loser at the ballot box before President Warren or somebody else would even take office. But what do you make of the very public blowback we're already seeing on the left to this?
Well, I think it's very much like Obamacare. The only thing that was bipartisan about Obamacare was the opposition to it. And you're seeing the exact same problem with single payer. The fact that Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are trying to sell it as Medicare for all when in reality it abolishes the current Medicare program. The fact that Bernie Sanders is trying to say middle class income families will come out ahead under single payer when they won't. The fact that Elizabeth Warren won't even admit that the middle class will have to pay higher taxes under single payer shows that the left cannot convince the American people on their arguments while telling them the truth, and that they have to try to hide the truth from the American people. And the opposition that is coming out from people like Nancy Pelosi to single payer shows that the American people are discovering the truth of single payer. And the more they discover the truth, the less they like it.
Chris, we'll call time there for now. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Chris Jacobs is the author of The Case Against Single Payer. He's also founder and CEO of the Juniper Research Group. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.